You think your boss is a nightmare? Maybe you're tired of long weeks and passive-aggressive emails. Trust me, the job market in ancient China makes your office look like a vacation. Today, if you mess up a spreadsheet, you might get a stern email or a talk from HR. Back then, if you messed up the emperor's tea, you'd literally lose your head. We're talking about guys who had to taste poison for a living just to make sure a king didn't drop dead at lunch. There were servants who spent their whole lives carrying royal poop around in fancy golden boxes. Some men even voluntarily gave up their manhood just to secure a government pension. I'm just a guy reading stories about history's weirdest paychecks, so hit that subscribe button if you want to stay for the whole shift. Where are you listening from tonight? Let's get to work. The story really starts in the Forbidden City. This place was the heart of everything in China for hundreds of years. Now, the guy at the very center of this massive palace was the emperor. But you have to understand something right away. He wasn't just a king or a politician. He was the Son of Heaven. That sounds like a cool title, but it came with some very strange rules. In those days, people believed he was a living god. And because he was a god, he was treated like he was made of glass. Think about your own day for a second. You get out of bed, you put on your socks, you brush your teeth, and maybe you make a sandwich. The emperor didn't do any of that. He actually couldn't do any of that. If he reached out to open a door himself, it was seen as a total failure. It was almost like a crime against his own status. If he picked up a robe to put it on, he was lowering himself. So he just stood there. He stood still while a small army of people swirled around him to do every single little thing you can imagine. This created a demand for jobs that sound totally fake. We're talking about thousands of people living in the palace whose only goal in life was to make sure this one family never had to lift a finger. You had people whose entire career was just wiping the emperor's face with a warm cloth. Not once or twice, but all day long. You had people who did nothing but stand by a door so they could open it the exact second he walked toward it. He didn't even have to look at them. He just walked, and the door magically opened. If he was thirsty, he didn't go get a glass of water. A guy would bring a golden tray, another guy would pour the tea, and a third guy would probably test it to make sure it wouldn't burn the emperor's tongue. It was a massive, expensive machine made of human beings. There were nearly 10,000 rooms in that palace, and those rooms were filled with servants who had these hyper-specific roles. Some of these people spent their whole lives learning how to do one tiny task perfectly. Maybe they were the ones who folded his blankets. Maybe they were the ones who made sure his shoes were lined up exactly an inch apart. It sounds like a dream to have everyone do everything for you, but it turned the emperor into a prisoner of his own importance. He was the most powerful man in the world, but he couldn't even wash his own hands with a committee helping him. This environment is where the weirdest jobs in history were born. It wasn't about being efficient, it was about showing off. Every time a servant did a mundane task for the emperor, it was a reminder to everyone watching that this man was more than human. And that meant the palace needed a lot of hands to keep the god moving. So, if the emperor is a god, what does that make you? If you're one of those thousands of people working in the palace, you aren't exactly a valued employee. There's no HR department to complain to. There are no weekends off. You're more like a piece of furniture that happens to breathe. Think about the scale of this for a second. The palace wasn't just a house, it was a city inside a city. And every single person inside those walls had a specific spot on a ladder. But here's the thing. That ladder was incredibly slippery, and it was leaning against a wall that was always on fire. At the bottom, you had the servants and the eunuchs. If you were in this group, you didn't even own yourself. You were property. You were bought and sold, just like a horse or a wagon. If the emperor woke up on the wrong side of the bed and decided he didn't like the way you walked, he could have you beaten or killed right there. No trial, no questions asked. You were a tool used to keep the god moving, and if a tool breaks, you just throw it away and get a new one. That was the reality. You weren't a person. You were an object with a heartbeat. Now, you might think the guys at the top had it better. These were the high-ranking officials and the advisors. They wore the fancy silk robes. They lived in the nice houses. But in a way, their lives were even more stressful. See, the closer you are to the sun, the easier it is to get burned. Working for the emperor was like trying to pet a tiger while it's eating. You had to be perfect every single second of every single day. If you gave him advice that didn't work out, or if you accidentally offended him during a ceremony, you weren't just losing your job, you were losing your life. But it gets much darker than that. In ancient China, they had a punishment that makes a simple execution look like a slap on the wrist. They called it the 9 familial exterminations. It is exactly as bad as it sounds. Let's say you're a high-level official. You've spent your whole life studying, you've climbed the ranks, and you're finally in the inner circle. One day, you make a mistake. Maybe you lose a battle, or you're accused of plotting against the throne. The emperor decides you've committed a crime against the state. In most places, that's where your story ends. They kill you, and that's it. But in this system, your mistake was a death sentence for everyone you ever cared about. The executioners would come for you first. Then they'd go for your parents, then your grandparents. They'd find your children and your grandchildren. They'd track down your brothers and sisters, your uncles, your aunts, and even your cousins. They wanted to make sure that not a single person with your blood stayed alive. They wanted to erase your entire existence from the earth. It wasn't enough to kill you. They wanted to kill the very idea of you. They'd go back generations and forward generations. If you had a toddler nephew living in a different province who didn't even know what your job was, he was still on the list. If you had an elderly grandmother who could barely walk, the soldiers would still show up at her door. It was a total wipeout. When you understand that, the strange jobs we're about to talk about start to make a lot more sense. These weren't just quirky roles or historical oddities. Every person holding a fan, every person tasting food for poison, and every person cleaning the emperor's floors was walking a tightrope over a canyon. If you were the guy in charge of the emperor's sleep schedule, or the person who had to watch him eat, you weren't doing it for a paycheck. You were doing it because if you failed, your entire family tree would be cut down. The stakes weren't about a promotion or a bonus. They were about survival. Every day was a gamble where the only prize was being allowed to do it all again tomorrow. This fear was the engine that kept the palace running. It wasn't about loyalty. It was about the fact that if you tripped, everyone you loved died with you. That is the world these workers lived in, and that is why even the smallest job was a matter of life and death. That idea of life and death wasn't just a metaphor. For one group of men, it was the literal price of admission. If you wanted to get anywhere near the real power in China, you didn't just need a resume, you needed a knife. I'm talking about the eunuchs. You've probably heard the word before, but the reality of the job was way weirder and more brutal than you might think. Imagine you're a guy living in a tiny village. You're starving. Your family is starving. You look at the palace in the distance, and you see the only place in the world where people actually have food and silk robes. But there's a catch. The emperor is the only real man allowed to live there. He has hundreds of wives, and he doesn't want any competition. So if you want a job inside those walls, you have to give up the one thing that makes you a man. This wasn't some clean hospital procedure. He was basically a specialist who did this for a living. You'd sit on a bench, they'd wrap your legs tight so you couldn't move, and they'd ask you one last time if you were sure. If you said yes, they didn't waste any time. They took everything off with one swipe of a small curved blade. No painkillers, maybe some hot tea or a bit of numbing herbs if you were lucky, but mostly you just had to take it. After that, they'd plug the wound with a bit of paper or a plug and make you walk around for a few hours so you didn't bleed out or seize up. If you survived the infection, and a lot of guys didn't, you were officially a eunuch. You'd take your parts, put them in a jar of alcohol, and keep them for the rest of your life. Why? Because you'd need them to show them to get a promotion later. Plus, they believed that if you weren't buried with all your pieces, you wouldn't get into heaven. It was a weird kind of insurance policy. So why on earth would anyone do this to themselves? It sounds insane, right? But you have to understand the math. For a poor person, this was the only way to jump from the bottom of the ladder to the very top. Once you were in the palace, you were close to the emperor, and in ancient China, being close to the emperor meant you were rich. You didn't have a family to support anymore, so every cent you made stayed with you. The emperor loved these guys. He trusted them more than his own generals or his own brothers. Think about it. A general can start a rebellion, take the throne, and start his own family line. But a eunuch, he can't have kids. He has no legacy to leave behind. If he tries to take over, it ends with him. That made them safe in the eyes of the emperor. He let everything run. During the day, these guys weren't just servants. They were the ones who actually ran the country. They handled the taxes, they wrote the laws, and they decided who got to talk to the emperor and who didn't. If you wanted a favor from the government, you didn't go to a politician. You went to a eunuch, and you brought a big bag of gold. But it wasn't all just sitting around signing papers and taking bribes. The actual physical work was bizarre. Some eunuchs were basically human furniture.
There was a rule that the emperor's feet should never touch the ground when he was outside. So, if he wanted to get into a carriage or walk across a muddy courtyard, a eunuch would have to drop down on all fours and act as a human stepping stool. Others spent their whole lives just carrying him. Imagine being part of a team of 8 guys holding a massive gold chair. You have to walk in perfect rhythm. If you stumble, if you tilt the chair even an inch, you're dead. You're literally a human engine. They did everything. They tasted his food to make sure it wasn't poisoned. They bathed him. They even had to stand outside his bedroom at night and take notes on everything that happened inside. It was a total lack of privacy for the emperor, but for the eunuchs, it was pure power. They knew every secret. They knew who was in favor and who was about to be executed. By the end of it, these guys often became the wealthiest and most hated people in China. They started out as desperate, poor men who had to mutilate themselves just to survive, but they ended up as the ones pulling the strings behind the throne. They traded their manhood for a life where they never had to be hungry again. It was a gamble. You either died on a wooden bench under a knife, or you lived long enough to become the shadow ruler of the world. For thousands of men, that was a deal they were willing to make. So, you survived the knife.
You made it into the palace. You think you're safe? Not even close. You just traded one kind of danger for another. Because in the Forbidden City, death didn't always come from a crowded battlefield or a dark alley. Sometimes it came on a gold plate, hidden inside a piece of juicy roasted duck. Think about that gamble for a second. Trading your body for power was one thing, but there was another guy in the palace who took a massive risk every single day just by opening his mouth. He wasn't looking to rule the world. He was just trying to make sure the boss didn't drop dead halfway through lunch. I'm talking about the food taster. Now imagine you're the emperor. You're the most powerful man in the country. You've got everything. But you're also completely terrified. Why? Because half the people in your house probably want you gone. And the easiest way to kill a king isn't with an army. It's with a tiny bit of powder in his soup. Poison is quiet. It's clean. It doesn't make a scene until it's way too late. So for the emperor, every meal wasn't a relaxing break. It was a high-stakes investigation. Here is how a normal dinner worked. The emperor didn't just walk into a kitchen and grab a snack when he was hungry. He didn't even eat in a dining room most of the time. He ate wherever he happened to be. When he said he was ready, a literal parade of servants started moving. We are talking about over 100 different dishes, soups, meats, veggies, sweets, all laid out on huge tables. But the emperor didn't touch a single bite. He just sat there and watched. He had a whole team of people whose only job was to make sure that food wasn't a death sentence. First, they used a bit of ancient science. A servant would walk up to every single plate with a small silver needle. He would poke that needle right into the middle of the food. Back then, people believed that if there was poison in the dish, the silver would turn black immediately. If the needle stayed shiny, the food passed the first test. But the people in charge weren't stupid. They knew silver didn't catch everything. Some toxins don't even react with metal at all. So they needed a backup plan, a human backup plan. That's where you come in. You're the taster. You're standing there in this massive, silent room. You're looking at 100 plates of the best food on the planet. It smells incredible, but you aren't enjoying it. You're terrified. A servant takes a small portion of a dish and puts it in a bowl for you. You eat it while the emperor stares at you. Then you wait. You don't just take a bite and move on. You have to stand there for a specific amount of time while everyone watches your face. They are looking for anything, a cough, a twitch, a bead of sweat. If you don't fall over dead or start clutching your stomach in 5 minutes, the emperor might decide that specific dish is safe. Then you do it again and again for every single plate he wants to try. Think about the stress of that. You're doing this 3 or 4 times a day. Every meal is a game of Russian roulette. And here's the kicker. The emperor usually only took 2 or 3 bites of a dish anyway. He never ate more than 3 spoonfuls of anything on the table. He did this so no one would ever know what his favorite food was. If an assassin knew the emperor loved the spicy pork, that's exactly where they would put the poison next time. So, as the taster, you had to eat a bit of everything, just in case. By the time the emperor actually started eating, the food was usually cold. But he didn't care about the temperature. He cared about staying alive. This job had a massive turnover rate, and it wasn't just because of actual poisonings. If the emperor got a stomach ache, even if it was just because he ate too much, You were the first person the guards grabbed. If the boss felt sick, they assumed you were in on a plot to kill him. You were the fall guy for every bad shrimp or undercooked piece of chicken in the palace. You lived in a constant state of panic. You were eating like a king, but you felt like a man on death row. You spent your entire day waiting to see if your last meal was actually going to be your last meal. Most of these guys didn't last long, not because they died from poison, but because the sheer stress of waiting to die eventually broke them. It was a golden cage, and the only way out was usually in a box. But if you thought the poison testers had it rough, you haven't met the guy who worked the morning shift in the Emperor's bathroom. You see, being the Emperor wasn't just about wearing a crown and sitting on a throne. You were considered a literal god. People called him the Son of Heaven. Because of that, people believed his entire physical form was divine. They called it the dragon body. And when you're a god, even the stuff you leave behind in the bathroom is considered a big deal. It wasn't just waste. To the people in the palace, it was a sacred indicator of the empire's future. That's where the groom of the Imperial toilet comes in. Now, I know what you're thinking. Groom sounds like a fancy title for someone who brushes horses or fixes hair. But in this case, the only thing he was grooming was a bucket. This guy had one of the most awkward, smelly, and strangely important jobs in the entire palace. Imagine you've spent years of your life studying and working your way up the ranks of the royal servants. You finally get the call. You've been promoted. Your new job? You're the guy who stands behind the emperor when he has to go. Here's how a typical morning went. The emperor didn't use a normal bathroom like you or me. He had a special stool, often made of expensive wood or even lined with gold. But the real secret was what was inside the container underneath. It wasn't just an empty pot. The groom had to prepare it with a very specific layer of materials. Depending on which dynasty we're talking about, it was usually either fine, dry sand or a thick layer of soft bird feathers. There was a very practical, if weird, reason for the feathers. See, a god isn't supposed to make human noises. If the emperor was doing his business and there was a loud splash, it would be embarrassing. It would make him seem like just another guy. The feathers acted like a silencer. They caught everything perfectly, so there was no noise, no splash, and most importantly, no smell. The feathers would just wrap around the waist and seal it off instantly. The groom's job was to make sure that bucket was positioned perfectly every single time. If a splash happened, or if the emperor was offended by a bad smell, it was your neck on the line. But the job didn't end when the emperor walked away. In fact, that was just the beginning of the groom's duties. Once the emperor was done, the groom had to carefully carry that bucket through the palace to the royal doctors. This wasn't a quick handoff either. These doctors were the best in the land, and they were waiting for that bucket like it was a gift from the heavens. They would take sticks and poke through the contents. They would check the color. They would check the texture. They'd even lean in and take a good sniff. They were looking for any tiny sign that the dragon body was out of balance. If the emperor was getting a cold, or if he was eating too much rich food, or if he was being poisoned slowly, the doctors would find the evidence in that bucket long before the emperor actually felt sick. The groom had to stand there and wait while the doctors did their analysis, essentially acting as the middleman between the emperor's gut and the empire's medical team. It sounds like a nightmare, right? You're basically a glorified janitor for a god. You're covered in smells that won't wash off, and you're carrying a bucket of waste through a palace filled with beautiful people. But here's the crazy part. people actually fought for this job. In the weird world of the imperial court, proximity was everything. The groom of the imperial toilet was one of the only people in the world allowed to be in a room alone with the emperor when he was vulnerable. Think about it. When you're in the bathroom, you aren't wearing your heavy robes or your crown. You're just a guy. The emperor would sit there and vent. He'd complain about his wife, or he'd grumble about a general who was annoying him, or he'd worry out loud about a war on the border. The groom heard it all. He knew the emperor's secrets, his fears, and his health status before anyone else in the world. That gave the groom a massive amount of power. If a high-ranking official wanted to know if the emperor was in a good mood, they didn't ask a general. They went to the guy with the bucket. They'd pull him aside and slip him some money just to find out if the emperor's digestion was doing okay that morning. Because if the emperor's stomach was upset, nobody was getting their laws signed that day. It was a total trade-off. You had to do a job that most people wouldn't touch for any amount of money. You had to deal with the grossest parts of the human body every single day. But in exchange, you became one of the most well-informed and influential people in the palace. You were the keeper of the most intimate secrets in the empire, all because you knew exactly how to layer feathers in a gold-plated bucket. It just goes to show that in ancient China, if you were willing to deal with the smell, you could get pretty close to the throne, or at least the backside of it. So, yeah, being the guy who cleans the royal toilet was gross, but at least you weren't the guy whose job it was to tell the emperor he was making a huge mistake. That is a whole different kind of mess. Think about your own job for a second. Think about your boss. Now, imagine your boss isn't just a guy in a suit who can fire you. Imagine your boss is a living god. He owns the building, he owns the street outside, and he literally owns your life. If he gets a headache, it is everyone's problem. If he gets bored, he might decide to start a war just to see what happens. This was the reality in ancient China, and in this world there was a specific job title called the remonstrator. I know, it sounds like a name for a vacuum cleaner or a robot from a bad movie. It sounds noble, right? Like something out of a movie where the hero stands up for what is right. And on paper, it was a great system. The idea was that no one person should have total power without someone there to keep them in check. The government actually paid these guys to sit in the room and wait for the emperor to do something stupid so they could call him out on it. But here's the catch. There was no HR department. There were no labor laws. If the emperor didn't like what you had to say, he didn't just give you a bad performance review. He killed you. Sometimes he killed your whole family, too, just for good measure. So you're sitting there in the palace, wearing your fancy robes, and you see the emperor start talking about spending the entire national budget on a giant marble boat or a private zoo for his favorite cats. You know it's a terrible idea. You know the country will go broke. You know the people will starve. And then you remember your job description. You have to speak up. If you don't, you're a failure. If you do, you're probably a dead man. Let's talk about a guy named Guan Long Feng. This was way back in the early days. He worked for an emperor named Jie, who was, by all accounts, a total disaster. Jie didn't care about the people. He spent his days drinking and doing whatever he wanted while the country fell apart. Guan Long Feng decided he couldn't just sit there and watch it happen. He walked into the throne room, held up a map of the country, and told the emperor that the people were suffering and that he needed to change his ways. He basically told the most powerful man on earth that he was failing at his job. Do you think Jie said, "You know what, Guan, you've got a point"? Not a chance. He got so angry that he didn't just kill Guan, he had him executed on the spot. This happened all the time. There was another guy, Wu Kuei, during a different dynasty. He did his job and pointed out that the emperor's new building projects were way too expensive. He was just trying to save the government some money. The emperor got so offended by this insult that he ordered Wu Kuei to be cut in half at the waist. I want you to really picture that. 1 minute you're talking about budget spreadsheets and construction costs, and the next minute guards are dragging you out to saw you in two.
It wasn't a quick death either. It was slow, it was loud, and it was meant to terrify anyone else who thought about opening their mouth. That was the fundamental conflict of the job. You were paid to be the conscience of a man who didn't want a conscience. It was a psychological game of chicken. Every time a remonstrator stood up to speak, they were betting their life on the emperor's mood. But if he was tired or hungover or just feeling petty, that was it for you. And the methods of execution weren't exactly gentle. We aren't just talking about a quick sword to the neck. If an emperor was really pissed off, he'd get creative. There were stories of remonstrators being boiled alive in giant bronze vats. They'd fill these huge pots with water or oil, light a fire underneath, and toss the guy in. Imagine standing in front of the throne, looking at one of those vats in the corner of the room, and then deciding to tell the guy sitting on the gold chair that his new tax plan is a bad idea. That takes a level of guts that most of us can't even imagine. Some emperors actually liked the drama of it. They wanted to be seen as these grand, tolerant figures who could handle criticism. But it was a trap. It was like when your girlfriend asks if her new haircut looks bad. She says she wants the truth, but if you give it to her, you're sleeping on the couch. Only in ancient China, the couch was a wooden coffin. One of the most famous examples of this working out, at least for a while, was a guy named Wei Zhang. He worked for Emperor Taizong of the Tang dynasty. Taizong is usually remembered as one of the good emperors, mostly because he actually listened to Wei Zhang. Wei Zhang was famous for being incredibly annoying. He would argue with the emperor until his face turned red. He would stop the emperor from going on hunting trips or spending too much money on his palace. He was talking about Wei Zhang. His wife, the empress, had to go change into her formal robes and congratulate him. She basically tricked him into not killing the guy by telling him it made him look cool. Wei Zhang got to keep his head that day, but he lived every single hour of his life on the edge of a blade. The job didn't just involve talking either. You had to write these things down. You'd spend all night writing a long, detailed letter explaining why the emperor's latest idea was stupid. Then you'd walk into the hall the next morning, hand over the scroll, and wait. You'd watch the emperor's face as he read it. You'd look for the slight twitch in his eyebrow or the way his jaw tightened. That was the moment you knew if you were going home to dinner or if your kids were going to be orphans by noon. It's the ultimate high-stakes career. You get the best education, the highest status, and a seat right next to the most powerful person in the world. You're part of the elite, but the price of that seat is that you have to be willing to die for a piece of advice that your boss probably won't even follow. It makes your worst day at the office look like a vacation. You might have a boss who sends annoying emails at 11 p.m., but at least he can't have you boiled in oil because you pointed out a typo in the quarterly report. In the end, the remonstrator was a job for the brave, the suicidal, or the people who truly believed that the country was more important than their own skin. They were the only thing standing between a total dictator and total chaos.
And usually the reward for that service was a very messy, very public death. It just goes to show that in the royal court, the closer you were to the power, the easier it was for that power to crush you. But hey, death wasn't the only weird thing waiting for you if you got a job at the palace. Sometimes the job was just plain uncomfortable. I'm talking about the kind of job where you look at your life and wonder how you even got there. Imagine being a woman in your early 20s. You just had a baby, you're tired, you're busy, and you're just trying to figure out motherhood in a small village. Then, a group of government officials shows up at your door. They aren't there to congratulate you or give you a tax break. They're there to recruit you for one of the strangest roles in human history. You were going to be a wet nurse. But you weren't going to be feeding a baby. You were going to be feeding a grown man, specifically the emperor. Now, you might be wondering why the most powerful guy in the country would want to drink breast milk. It sounds like a bizarre hobby, but they actually had what they thought was a scientific reason for it. Back then, people in the royal court were completely obsessed with living forever. They tried everything you can think of. They ate ground-up jade, they drank liquid gold, they even swallowed mercury, which, as you can guess, usually ended up killing them pretty quickly. But one theory really stuck around for a long time. They believed that human milk was the ultimate medicine. To them, it wasn't just food for babies. They thought it was the literal fountain of youth. They believed that if an old man drank enough of it, he could reverse the aging process. He'd get his energy back, his skin would clear up, and he might just live for 1,000 years. It was basically the superfood craze of the ancient world, taken to a very weird extreme. The palace didn't just pick any woman off the street for this job. They were incredibly picky about who got the job. This was a massive, organized operation. They looked for women who were young, usually between 15 and 20 years old. You had to have just given birth to your first or second child because they wanted the milk to be as fresh and nutrient-heavy as possible. But the physical requirements didn't stop there. They looked at your face like they were judging a beauty pageant. They believed that if a woman looked mean or stressed, her milk would actually become toxic or sour. You had to have a serene look. They'd check your skin for scars, look at your teeth, and even check your family history for 3 generations back to make sure nobody in your house had ever been sick. If you passed all these tests, you were taken away from your home, your husband, and your own baby. You were moved into a special wing of the palace, and your life changed forever. Once you were inside those walls, the rules were intense. You weren't there to hang out or enjoy the palace gardens. You were there to be a milk production machine. They controlled every single thing you did, but mostly they controlled everything you ate. They believed the flavor and the power of the milk changed based on the food you put in your body. So they put these women on a diet that sounds absolutely miserable. They had to eat a massive amount of chicken and fish every day to keep their protein up. But there was a catch. They weren't allowed to use any salt. No salt, no soy sauce, no ginger, and definitely no garlic or onions. They thought spices and salt would make the milk thin and bitter. Imagine eating boiled, unseasoned pork fat and plain chicken every single day for years. These women were surrounded by the best chefs in the world who were making amazing, flavorful meals for the rest of the court, while they had to sit in a room and choke down the most boring food on earth. Think about the actual day-to-day reality of this job. You have a powerful, elderly man, maybe the emperor himself, or a high-ranking official who's terrified of getting old. And then you have this young woman who has absolutely no choice in being there. When it was time for the treatment, the emperor didn't use a cup or a bowl. Most historical accounts say he drank it directly. It is hard to imagine a more awkward or lopsided power dynamic than that. You have the ruler of millions of people, a guy who can decide who lives or dies with a snap of his fingers, but he's spending his morning acting like a newborn. For the woman, she was technically keeping the most powerful man in the world alive with her own body. But she wasn't treated like a hero. She was treated more like a piece of high-end medical equipment. These women stayed in the palace for years. That's the part that really gets me. To give the emperor his daily immortality juice, these women had to give up raising their own kids. They were completely isolated. Sure, they were paid well. Their families back in the village usually got a big pile of money or a piece of land, which was a life-changing deal for a poor farmer. But the cost was that the woman became a prisoner in silk robes. Some emperors were so obsessed with this that they had dozens of these women on call at all times. They'd drink a bowl before bed and another one as soon as they woke up. They treated it like a daily vitamin. They really truly believed it would keep their hearts beating forever. Spoiler alert, it didn't work. Every single one of them died anyway. But for centuries, this was considered a top-tier medical strategy. It just goes to show that when you have unlimited power and a fear of death, things get real weird real fast. And in the palace, the weirdest jobs always fell on the people who had the least amount of say in the matter. You would think the worst job in the palace would be something like cleaning out the stables or hauling heavy stones in the summer heat. But no, the real nightmare was being the guy in charge of bugs, specifically the guy in charge of crickets. Now, I know what you're thinking. It sounds like a joke. How hard can it be to look after a few insects? But in ancient China, especially during the Ming Dynasty, cricket fighting was not a hobby. It was a massive, high-stakes obsession for the people at the very top. And when the guy sitting on the throne decides he likes something, everyone else has to make it their entire life. This is how we ended up with a job called the cricket minister. This was a real, high-ranking official whose only job was to make sure the emperor had a constant supply of champion bugs. Think of it like being a scout for a professional sports team, but instead of looking for the next superstar basketball player, you're crawling around in the dirt behind a barn at 2 in the morning, trying to catch an insect with a particularly loud chirp. The emperor and his buddies would spend millions on these fights. They didn't just put 2 bugs in a bowl and watch. They had tiny gold-trimmed arenas. They had tiny porcelain jars for the bugs to live in. They even had doctors who specialized in insect medicine. It sounds silly until you realize that people were literally betting their houses and their lives on which bug would bite the other one first. Because the stakes were so high for the rich people, the pressure on the people at the bottom was almost impossible to handle. If you were a local official in a small village, you didn't just pay your taxes in grain or silver. The government would send out an order saying your village owed the palace 10 superior crickets by the end of the month. This wasn't a request, it was a demand. If those crickets didn't show up, or if they showed up and they were weak and lost their first fight, you were in huge trouble. We're talking about being fired, thrown in jail, or worse. So, what did these local leaders do? They panicked. They would stop everything. They would tell the farmers to stop growing food and get out into the fields to catch bugs. Imagine you're a farmer. You have a family to feed, you have crops that need water,
But instead, you're forced to spend 18 hours a day flipping over rocks because if you don't find a bug that looks angry enough, the local magistrate is going to take your land or beat you in the town square. There is one story that really shows how dark this got. There was a man who worked as a low-level clerk. His boss told him he had to find a champion cricket or he would be held responsible for the village's tax debt. This man spent every cent he had. He went into massive debt just to buy a bug from a professional hunter that looked like it could win. He finally bought one. He brought it home and hid it in a jar, treating it like it was made of solid gold. This bug was his only way out. But then his small son got curious. The kid wanted to see what all the fuss was about.
He opened the jar, the cricket jumped out, and while the kid was trying to catch it, he accidentally crushed it. The bug died right there on the floor. When the kid realized what he had done, he was so terrified of what the government would do to his father that he ran out and threw himself into a well. The father came home to find his son dead and his future ruined, all because of a 1-inch insect. That wasn't just a one-time thing. The demand for these bugs created a literal black market. A single champion cricket could be worth more than a dozen horses. People would sell their daughters into domestic service just to buy a bug that might save the rest of the family from the tax collectors. And even if you caught a good one, the job wasn't over. You had to train it. The cricket minister had a whole team of people who did nothing but tickle the bugs. They used tiny sticks with a single hair from a hare's ear tied to the end. They would poke the crickets to get them frustrated and aggressive. They fed them a special diet of boiled chestnuts, yellow beans, and sometimes even chopped up mosquitoes. If a cricket got sick, they gave it tiny drops of herbal tea. If it died, they actually held tiny funerals for them. Think about that for a second. While people in the countryside were starving because they weren't allowed to tend their crops, guys in the palace were burying bugs in silver coffins. It was a total disconnect from reality. The people who held these jobs lived in a constant state of fear. The cricket minister knew that his entire career depended on the mood of an insect. If the emperor's favorite bug lost a fight, the emperor would look for someone to blame, and the guy who picked the bug was the easiest target. It was a job that sounds like a kid's dream, playing with bugs all day, but it was actually a death sentence hanging over your head. It turned the most powerful empire on earth into a place where a bad day for a cricket meant a disaster for a whole province. When you look at the history books, they talk about the wars and the Great Walls, but the real story of power is often found in the small stuff. It's found in the fact that a man could lose his family, his home, and his life because he couldn't find a bug that was good enough at kicking. It shows you that when a ruler has too much power and too much time on his hands, even the smallest thing can become a weapon that destroys everyone in its path. Being the cricket minister wasn't about the bugs. It was about surviving the whims of a man who thought the whole world was just a game played in a porcelain jar.
But as scary as it was to lose a lucky cricket, there was a job in ancient China that was way worse. It didn't just depend on a boss having a bad day. It was a job that was designed from the very first day you showed up to end with your death. If the cricket minister was playing a game of chance, these guys were playing a game they had already lost before they even picked up a shovel. I'm talking about the tomb builders. You've probably seen pictures of the Terracotta Army. It's that massive underground city of clay soldiers. each one with a different face, standing guard over the first emperor, Qin Shi Huang. It looks incredible on a travel brochure, but for the people who actually built it, that place wasn't a wonder of the world. It was a giant high-tech trap that they were building for themselves. Let's look at the scale of this project. You have to understand that this wasn't just a weekend DIY job. This thing took nearly 40 years to build. We're talking about over 700,000 workers. To put that in perspective, imagine taking every single person in a city like Seattle and telling them their only purpose in life is to dig one giant hole. These workers weren't just digging, though. They were specialists. You had guys who did nothing but mix clay. You had artists who spent every waking hour carving the eyelids and hair on those clay soldiers. You had engineers who designed the mechanical systems. And then you had the heavy lifters. They hauled massive stones from miles away. They dug so deep into the earth that they hit groundwater, and they had to pour molten copper into the cracks to stop the site from flooding. It was backbreaking, dangerous, and loud. And then there were the luxury features. The emperor didn't just want a room, he wanted a whole world. He had craftsmen build entire rivers and seas on the floor of the tomb, but instead of water, they filled them with liquid mercury. They used mechanical pumps to keep the mercury flowing so it would look like it was moving. Now, we know today that mercury is incredibly toxic. Just being around it for a few minutes can make you sick. Imagine being the guy who had to pour hundreds of gallons of it into a stone ditch. But the real dark part of the job description wasn't the mercury or the heavy lifting. It was the security. The emperor was terrified that someone would break in after he died and steal his stuff. He had tons of gold, jewels, and precious items in there, so he had the engineers build traps. They rigged up giant crossbows inside the walls. These were set on hair triggers. If you stepped on the wrong floor tile or opened the wrong door, a bolt would fly out and pin you to the wall. The guys who built those traps were the best in the business. They knew every inch of that tomb. They knew where the crossbows were hidden. They knew how to walk across the floor without setting off the sensors. They knew exactly where the entrance was hidden under the dirt. And that's exactly why their job was a death sentence. See, the emperor's son and his advisors had a problem. Once the emperor was finally dead and buried inside that massive palace, you had several thousand workers who knew exactly how to get back in.
If you want to keep a secret, you can't have thousands of people walking around who know the combination to the safe. So here is how the final day of the job went down. The funeral is finally over. The emperor's body is resting in the center of the palace. The mercury rivers are flowing. The gold is polished. The 700,000 workers have mostly been sent away, but the core group, the artisans, the engineers, and the guys who knew the inner workings are still inside. They're probably finishing up the final touches. Maybe they're cleaning the dust off the clay soldiers or checking the tension on the crossbow traps one last time. They probably think they're going home. They've spent their whole lives on this project. They're thinking about the pay they've been promised. They're thinking about seeing their families. But then the soldiers outside get the signal. The tomb had 3 main gates. The workers were all tucked away in the middle section. First, the soldiers closed the middle gate. It was a massive slab of stone. There were no handles on the inside, no way to push it back open. Then they closed the outer gate. They didn't just lock it, they covered it with dirt and rocks until it looked like just another part of the hill. They planted grass and trees over it so nobody could ever find the seam where the door used to be. Just like that, the lights went out. The workers weren't builders anymore.
They were trapped in the dark with the man they had spent 40 years serving. There was no way out, no air vents, no secret exits, just the sound of the mercury flowing and the silence of the clay soldiers. The people outside didn't call it a massacre. They didn't want the location of the tomb or the secrets of the traps to ever be leaked. You have to wonder what those last few hours were like. You're standing in the most expensive room ever built, surrounded by more gold than you could spend in 1,000 lifetimes, and it's all completely worthless. You can't eat it. You can't use it to buy a way out. You just sit there in the dark, waiting for the air to run out, while the rest of the world goes on living above your head. The crazy thing is, it worked. For over 2,000 years, that tomb stayed a secret. People knew it was somewhere near the mountain, but nobody could find the door. It wasn't until 1974, when some farmers were digging a well, that they accidentally punched through the ceiling and found the clay soldiers. When you look at those soldiers today, they look like art. They look like a masterpiece. But you have to remember that every one of those clay faces was made by a man who never got to walk away from his work. They didn't just build the tomb, they became part of it. They were the ultimate security system, a group of people whose only way to finish their job was to never speak to another living person again. It's one thing to have a boss who treats you like a tool. It's another thing to have a boss who thinks you're just another brick in the wall. In the world of ancient jobs, being a builder for the emperor was the ultimate trap. You spent your life creating a palace, only to find out you were actually building your own coffin. So, the next time you feel like you're stuck at your desk and the day is never going to end, just remember the last guard. At least when your shift is over, someone actually lets you out the front door. These guys worked their whole lives for a retirement plan that consisted of a stone wall and a long, dark silence. And that is why being a tomb builder is hands down the darkest, strangest, and most terrifying job in the history of the ancient world. But as scary as it was to be locked in a tomb, there was something even worse, being left alive when the world you served just disappeared. For thousands of years, these strange jobs weren't just weird ways to make a living. They were the way the world worked. You were a food taster because there was an emperor to protect. You were a eunuch because there was a royal harem to guard. But in 1911, the music stopped. The whole machine of ancient China, which had been running for over 2,000 years, finally broke down. It started with a revolution, but it ended with a piece of paper. A 6-year-old kid named Pui was the last emperor. He didn't really understand what was happening, but his advisors did. They signed the papers, he gave up the throne, and just like that, the empire was dead. China was now a republic. But think about the thousands of people living inside the Forbidden City. These weren't politicians, they were the workers. And for them, the end of the empire wasn't a headline in a newspaper. It was a pink slip and a kick out the door. Let's talk about the eunuchs first, because they had it the worst. Think about what these guys did to get their jobs. They didn't just apply for a position. They gave up the chance to ever have a family. They literally sacrificed their bodies for a career that was supposed to last forever. The deal was simple. You serve the emperor, and the emperor takes care of you until you die. It was a lifetime contract. Then suddenly, the contract was shredded. When the new government took over, They didn't want thousands of palace servants hanging around. They started clearing them out. Imagine being one of these guys. You've spent 30 or 40 years inside a palace. You don't know how to farm. You don't know how to trade. You don't even know how to talk to regular people on the street. You walk out of those massive red gates carrying a small bundle of clothes and maybe a little bit of silver, and that's it. You're 60 years old, you have no children to take care of you, and the world thinks you're a freak. The eunuchs tried to stick together. A lot of them moved into old temples around Beijing. They lived in these cramped, falling-down rooms, pooling their money just to buy bowls of thin porridge. They were lonely, they were poor, and they were invisible. The new modern China wanted to move on, and these men were a reminder of a past everyone was trying to forget. They went from being the most trusted advisors in the world to being beggars on the street. It wasn't just a job loss, it was a total erasure of who they were. And it wasn't just the eunuchs. What do you do if you're a professional food taster in 1912? You spent your whole life training your tongue to catch the faint metallic taste of arsenic or the bitterness of hemlock. That's a pretty specific skill. You go to a local noodle shop and tell the owner you want to taste his soup for poison, and he's going to laugh you out of the building. Nobody needs a poison checker in a world with health inspectors and modern laws. These guys were highly trained professionals whose entire industry vanished overnight. Think about the guys whose only job was to hold a portable toilet for the emperor. Or the women whose sole purpose was to spend 4 hours a day brushing the royal hair. They had spent their lives perfecting these tiny, bizarre tasks. They were experts in things that no longer mattered. They walked out into a city that was starting to use electricity, cars, and telephones. They were like people from another planet. They had no idea how to survive in a world where you had to compete for a job instead of just being assigned one by a royal official. Most of these workers didn't have a happy ending. Without any family to lean on, many of them ended up in extreme poverty. You'd see former palace officials, people who used to wear silk robes and walk with kings, selling matches or old rags on the street corner. They were survivors of a wreck, but the ship they were on had been sinking for a long time. The tragedy wasn't just that they lost their paychecks, it was that they had shaped their entire lives, their bodies, their minds, and their futures around a system that didn't exist anymore. They were the living relics of a dead world. When you look back at these strange jobs, it's easy to laugh at how weird they were. But for the people doing them, it was their whole life. And when the emperor walked out of that palace for the last time, he didn't just leave a building. He left behind a whole class of people who had nowhere left to go and no way to fit into the future. They were the last of their kind, and when they finally passed away in those lonely temples, the strangest jobs in history died right along with them. It's a strange thought, isn't it? Those men in those quiet, crumbling temples were the last ones holding on to a world that doesn't exist anymore. When they died, they didn't just take their personal stories with them. They took a whole way of living. It was the end of a very long, very weird road that had been paved over thousands of years. You look back at everything we've talked about today, and it's really tempting to just laugh. I mean, let's be honest, some of this stuff sounds like a bad joke. We talked about guys whose entire career was based on how well they could predict the future by looking at the cracks in a burnt turtle shell. We talked about people who spent every waking hour making sure a king's bed was the exact right temperature before he laid down.
It sounds ridiculous to us. We live in a world where you can get a burger by tapping a piece of glass in your pocket. We don't have to worry about whether the stars are aligned before we decide to plant some corn or go on a trip. But here's the thing you have to remember. For hundreds and hundreds of years, these jobs weren't a joke. They weren't some quirky side hustle. They were the actual physical reality for millions of people. And when you strip away the weirdness and the distance of time, you see something very human underneath all that. You see people who were just trying to find a way to survive in a world that didn't really care much about them. Think about the security. That's the big word here, security. Back then, life was incredibly fragile. A bad storm could wipe out your entire village in a single afternoon. A local war could burn your house down before you even knew what started the fight. Most people lived on the edge of a cliff every single day of their lives. So if a job came along that offered you a steady meal and a roof that didn't leak, you took it. You didn't complain. Even if that job was embarrassing, even if it was dangerous, even if it meant you had to give up your dignity or your ability to ever have a family of your own. It was a trade. You gave up your freedom, and in return, the system gave you a place to stand. It gave you status. In ancient China, working for the government or the royal court was the ultimate goal. It didn't matter if you were the guy who had to clean the royal toilets. You were the royal toilet cleaner. That royal part meant everything. It meant you were protected. It meant your family had a connection to power. People would literally kill for that kind of stability. I think we forget how much people value knowing where their next meal is coming from. We take it for granted because we have grocery stores and refrigerators. But for a guy 2,000 years ago, that certainty was worth almost any price, even if the price was carrying a heavy bucket of sand across a courtyard for 10 hours a day, back and forth, just because a king liked the way the sun hit the grains when they were fresh. It sounds mindless. It was mindless. But at the end of that 10 hours, there was a bowl of hot food waiting for him. For a lot of people, that was enough. It had to be enough. Then you have the other side of it. The jobs where you were almost too good at what you did. Think about those tomb builders again. These guys weren't just laborers. They were brilliant engineers. They were masters of their craft. They spent decades of their lives carving out these massive, hidden cities underground. They did everything right. They made the traps work. They made the stone seals so tight you couldn't fit a hair between them. And their reward for being the best in the business was a death sentence. The moment the last stone was pushed into place, their luck ran out. The emperor couldn't risk them telling anyone where the gold was hidden or how to get past the arrows in the walls. So they got locked in. Imagine that for a second. You spend your whole life building something beautiful, something meant to last forever, and it becomes your own grave. That is a level of job pressure that we can't even imagine. You're literally working toward your own funeral. And yet, people still lined up for those roles. Why? Because for the 30 years it took to build that tomb, their families were fed. They were taken care of. They had a status that a regular farmer out in the mud could never dream of. They traded their ending for a better middle. They bought a good life for their kids with their own lives. It really puts our own lives into perspective, doesn't it? I know we all have those days. You wake up, the alarm goes off, and you just want to throw it against the wall. You've got a mountain of emails that don't matter. Your boss is breathing down your neck about a report that nobody is actually going to read. You feel like a tiny cog in a giant, heartless machine. It's easy to feel like our modern 9-to-5s are a kind of soul-crushing trap. And hey, sometimes they are. I'm not saying they aren't. But then you look back at these guys. You look at the guy who had to stand perfectly still for 12 hours holding a torch just so a hallway stayed lit. You look at the person whose only job was to cry and scream at a stranger's funeral so it looked like the dead guy was popular. You look at the eunuchs who gave up their entire future just to have a chance at a desk job in the palace. When you compare it like that, our world starts to look a lot better. I might hate my commute, but I don't have to worry about being buried alive because I know too much about the office floor plan. I might hate my boss, but he isn't going to have me executed because I didn't catch a falling leaf before it hit the ground in the garden. These strange jobs are gone now. The world changed, the dynasties fell, and the needs of the people shifted. We don't need turtle shell readers anymore because we have satellites and weather apps. We don't need royal taste testers because we have health inspectors and laws. The last of their kind we talked about earlier, they weren't just the end of a profession. They were the end of a specific kind of human struggle. So next time you're sitting at your desk or you're standing on your feet for an 8-hour shift and your back is killing you, just take a breath. Think about the guy with the sand. Think about the guy in the tomb. We might still be working for the man, and we might still be tired, but at least the stakes have changed. We got the better end of the deal. We get to go home at the end of the day. It's been a wild trip looking back at how people used to make a living. It's gross, it's scary, and sometimes it's just plain weird. But it's our history. It's the story of what we'll do to survive and feel like we matter. Anyway, that's all I've got for you on this one. Thanks for sticking around and listening. I'll catch you later.